Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
Today, we're beginning a weekly chapter by chapter discussion of the book The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. Kelton is an economist and leading thinker in modern monetary theory, also known as MMT. MMT is a topic that we've come back to again and again at Boston Basic Income. We tend to be sympathetic to some aspects of MMT, but critical of others. With this series of discussions, we will attempt to dig deeper and really flesh out our perspective on MMT. The Deficit Myth came out last year, summer of 2020, and quickly became a central point of reference for MMT advocates. The paperback edition of the book hit shelves just last month, so what better time than now to break it down for people? The main thesis of the book is that policymakers are unnecessarily constraining themselves by attempting to stick to a balanced budget. Government budget deficits are not necessarily a sign of a problem, and we are harming people by needlessly constraining ourselves and avoiding deficits that we think are too high. The myth then is the idea that government budget deficits are bad and that the government has to pay for everything using tax revenue. Something to keep in mind as we work our way through the book is that we are not exactly Kelton's target audience. Her audience seems to be people who've never really questioned the idea that government budget deficits are bad, along with already established MMT supporters who want an accessible text to rally around. Derek and I don't really fall into either of these categories. We generally agree with Kelton's conclusion that it's a costly mistake for governments to run balanced budgets, but we are less convinced by some of her specific supporting arguments, and in ways that have important implications for thinking about a policy like basic income. I read through most of the way through the book when it first came out, but I'm excited to be going through it again with you, Derek, and with anybody else who's following along.
Right. Yeah. I was looking forward to this. This will be my first time actually reading the book all the way through. Although I've heard Stephanie Kelton speak, and I've read a lot of other stuff that she's written and talked about. So I've been looking forward to this because I really like Kelton. I think of the different MMT authors, her perspective and the issues that she sort of zeroes in on are the closest to the things that I feel are important. And I think obviously there's some really important things that we agree with her on, specifically everything you talked about, how we're creating unnecessary harm by expecting that it's normal for deficits to reduce when that isn't necessarily the case. I think the difficulty, right, is because we agree so much on that point that I think a lot of what we talk about might sound like we're sort of harping on all the points where we disagree, but it's really just because we already agree on that point, so there isn't really probably that much need to keep going over it.
Yeah, I think that's right. So let's hop right into the book. Here's the first quote. Alongside the heartbreaking, so for this week we read the introduction. That includes the introduction to the paperback edition that just came out and the actual introduction from the original book. So we're going to start with the introduction to the paperback edition. So this is the new stuff. It's related to the COVID-19 crisis and the economic fallout from that. So here's the first quote. Alongside the heartbreaking death toll, another human tragedy quickly unfolded. In the first 2 months of the pandemic, a gut-wrenching collapse in employment snatched jobs from more than 22 million workers. Nearly 40% of households earning less than $40,000 a year lost work in March of 2020. So this is an interesting thing to frame as a kind of a crisis. At the beginning of the pandemic, we wanted people to stay home from work. We intentionally put the economy into a kind of hibernation mode. And, we can ask the question, isn't that exactly what we wanted to happen? So it's interesting that she's framing this as a crisis. And intuitively, we might think that, oh, it is a crisis. People are losing their jobs. They need jobs, et cetera. But it kind of goes against what we were intentionally doing at the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to point out that that's, of course, this is not just Kelton sort of using language like that. If you listen to the Federal Reserve's comments during the pandemic, there's a lot of things that indicate that, maybe not in quite that strong language, but they'll talk about how employment is essentially a public benefit that's they're trying very hard to distribute to more people, and which is unfortunately from their view not reaching people, right? And that does seem to work at cross purposes with a particular public health objective during the pandemic, which is, okay, people stay home, stop working please for the moment because it's dangerous. So I think I'm assuming that what the assumption people have here is that, like, well, normally, right, we want to maximize employment. But because of this horrible public health crisis, kind of like a war or some other emergency, we've got to divert some of that away, and we've got to tolerate this. But then while we're tolerating it, how do we manage this crisis as best as possible? So that's the lens they're using. But certainly, I would agree with you that that's a bit of a weird. That's a weird way to think about it. That when people benefit from their employment, they're benefiting from the money they get from those jobs to buy goods. Right? It's not that lacking the job itself is necessarily a crisis. If you imagine a country that really took care of its citizens and made sure that they had everything they needed while we temporarily removed some jobs from the economy, that would just mean we lose a couple goods, but no one really becomes super poor, right? They would still have access to other stuff. So I don't know. I don't know to what extent that this is just, if you're looking at jobs as being the only way people get income, then it's gonna seem natural to frame it this way, but it doesn't seem natural to us, obviously.
Yeah, and I mean, as you pointed out, of course, it's the case that if people can't work, then the economy can't produce stuff, and that's certainly a cost and a problem. But then there's this other side of it, this idea that not only does the economy need labor, do we need workers to contribute to the economy's production, but there's also this idea that's very much embedded not only in MMT but in mainstream economics. As central bankers think this way, as you were just mentioning, the idea that jobs are good, that we want people to be employed or to have opportunity for employment, and that full employment is a worthy goal, something that will make society better off, that kind of thing. So that's something that's very much, you'll see that come up again and again as we talk about MMT and as we go through this book. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that it's interesting, in light of what we know is coming in the book, that MMT proponents are often not a big fan of basic income, that she is kind of seemingly a decently big fan of various forms of kind of like free money during the pandemic in this introduction. So she talks about being a fan of the $600 unemployment supplement. She talks about, I think she's at least somewhat a fan of the $1,200 payments as well. She at least doesn't speak against them. And so, it's interesting to think about how she would view the economy during a pandemic as different. I mean, maybe it's kind of obvious, like she feels like usually we need all that labor, and right now we kind of need those people to stay home. But that, as we talk about in here, it's not always as stark a line as it might seem in the case of a pandemic. Like, do we really need all of that labor in normal times? In what ways are we, kind of propping it up? But I just wanted to point out that, like, she's not unequivocally against free money under all conditions or something like that. And in this pandemic, we have these examples where I think she sees it as a good thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And she does write about that. And I think the difference between sort of being in favor of free money, cash stimulus during the pandemic, and the difference between that and being in favor of something like a basic income is really the question of what we consider normal, right? In normal times, well, okay, the normal thing to do is to get people to get their money from jobs, and then when a crisis comes along and gets in the way of that, it's perceived as a tragedy. But where she writes that 40% of households earning less than $40,000 a year lost work in March, we would sort of ask the question of, well, are these people was their spending potential at its maximum prior to that event, right? Like, could these people have been made less poor in normal times, right? And if you're going to make them less poor, is wages the most efficient? Is it the best way to do that? That's where basic income comes in. And so you can be in favor of being super generous with fiscal policy unconditionally during an emergency, but not necessarily see the logic of normally doing that.
Yeah, and I think Stephanie could make 2 points that would seem reasonable here. Like, one is that things she might favor, like a jobs guarantee, can't get up and running fast enough for something like a crisis, such as the coronavirus crisis. So even if she thinks we should be paying people to do work related to coronavirus or something, it might not be feasible. And so just giving people money, she might argue, is like useful in an emergency situation in a way that's different. And then of course, the point that usually she might say we need more labor than we do when we have like a situation where we want everybody to stay home. So I guess that's partly what you were saying, Derek, but I don't think it's inconsistent. I just think it would be kind of an interesting conversation starter with her or someone else to say like, okay, so like during the pandemic, here is what you maybe were in favor of in terms of giving people money. Are there any other circumstances like where you would be in favor of that? What would those be? What if we really didn't need the labor? Like under normal circumstances, like how would you tell, given that you might be willing to agree that there might be circumstances like during a pandemic where we don't want everyone to work, like would there be another circumstance? How would you know what that is? I don't know if that would lead anywhere, but it could be an interesting point of like starting with a community who usually just kind of like opposes free money across the board, or like somewhat categorically, it seems, from at least my witnessing of Alex's debates online.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the news were that households earning less than $40,000 a year didn't have to work as much starting in March of 2020, but their income stayed the same or something like that, we'd be looking at that a little bit differently. So here's the next quote. And because most workers in the US are dependent upon their employers for healthcare coverage, the pandemic-induced recession also stripped an estimated 12 million people of their employer-sponsored health insurance. So here we get kind of to the crux of the issue. We have structured our economy in such a way that we're forcing people to depend on employers for their livelihoods. Not only are people expected to receive their healthcare coverage from employers, but they're also expected to receive their income from employers as well. These are problems that are solved by universal healthcare and basic income, respectively. But when the pandemic hit, we didn't have either of these systems in place. If we had, then keeping people home from work might not have been so damaging. So a question we can ask is, to what extent would we really have had this whole tension between the economy and keeping people protected from the virus?
Yeah, I think you can imagine, in one thing that has come up a lot is that people have talked about how during the pandemic that businesses have been motivated to shift the way they do things and to get by with less work and that sort of thing. And you can definitely imagine that if you actually made sure that people had a source of income, in order for businesses to still capture that income when there's a sudden loss of employment, that could certainly, a necessary loss of employment, you could even see that making us more adaptable to those kind of situations. So I think we've seen a lot of that already. The thing is that we can't really reap the benefits of that because we just don't have an efficient way for that benefit to be activated. We're relying on jobs to coincide. We're forcing them to coincide with benefit, and in that situation, I think in normal times it's not optimal. But during the pandemic, it just there's more friction added. It becomes more obvious.
Yeah, there's always a cost to employing people, and that cost is higher if you're going to infect them all with coronavirus when they go to work, right? So I think that's an important point. Let's get to the next quote here. To President Trump and many of his supporters, COVID-19 had upended the longest economic expansion on record, but the situation was improving rapidly, with a V-shaped bounce back in output and employment. Others, myself included, argued that we were experiencing a more K-shaped recovery, where parts of the economy surged upward even as millions fell deeper into crisis. So I just want to point out that output and employment are not necessarily tied together, especially when we're not efficiently employing people. Economic output requires employment. That's always going to be true, but employment doesn't necessarily imply economic output. And when we talk about, regardless of whether our economy is in hibernation mode or parts of it are surging back from the shutdown, it's always going to be a problem if people are being left behind. So if you have this K shape where some people are getting back to normal or improving, and then other people are just not able to get what they need out of the economy. That's always going to be a problem. But what's the point? And we can ask the question, what's the point of measuring the performance of the economy if we're not gauging it with respect to the well-being of the people? The idea that some parts of the economy are surging upward as people fall into crisis is maybe less important than the fact that there are some people who are maybe slipping into crisis or slipping into poverty when they don't have to be. So maybe it's not necessarily the V-shaped part of the recovery isn't a problem, but the downward shaped part of it is a problem. And it's maybe less about, employment. I guess MMT would emphasize employment, but what matters, I think, is whether people are okay in general.
Well, so when they're talking about the K-shaped recovery, they're expressing a concern, and I think it's a valid concern, that there are parts of the economy that are doing really well. But that doesn't mean that the parts of the economy that we care the most about are doing well, right? And then the question is, well, which parts do we care the most about? What is the most important part of the economy? And I don't think MMT would disagree with what I'm about to say, which is that obviously the people, right? We're the ones that matter the most, because the whole thing is there for our benefit, right? So the question is then, how do people benefit? How do we benefit from the economy? And I guess just I don't think that they were saying that there was a problem with the V shape. They were saying there was a problem with the K shape. And I think it's just, if you're imagining that workers, right, are the part of the economy that you're caring the most about, you can do that. You can prioritize of that part of the economy you can try to get that part of the economy to be as active as possible or as benefited as possible. But that doesn't mean that every person, right, is benefiting. It only means that the people that have managed to get through into the labor market are doing okay. So I think if anyone's ever concerned about the K-shaped recovery problem, or concerned about unequal distribution of economic benefit in general, I mean, the natural solution to that is to make sure you have a mechanism that benefits literally every person, every human in the economy. And then that when there's that V, it's like when you're going up, then everyone's doing better. When it's going down, everyone's doing worse, right? And then that gives us a base to kind of start from when we're thinking about how is the economy doing for people.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. The K-shape emphasizes that if all you see is the V, then you're missing part of the picture. But if you have a way of distributing the benefit that the economy provides, so that it gets to everyone, and you see some part of the economy is in a V shape, then you can be confident that the whole economy is in a V shape, and you're not just seeing part of a K.
Right. You can align the average with everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a difficult question in terms of like, when would you call it a K? Because there might always be like one person, who's getting worse while everybody else is getting better. So like, this is part of what I was wondering in terms of this K-shape argument, not to get overly kind of pedantic, but, does she mean like it's roughly equal? That would be like the implication of the K, right? That like about half of the economy is getting worse and about half of the economy is getting better. I think the implication is at least that it's like a very sizable chunk, and not just that there are some people who are getting worse, or like there are some vulnerable people. I think the point she's trying to make is that it's like a pretty decent size. I don't know what that cutoff would be, like a quarter or 30% or whatever, but she goes on to talk about millions more people falling into poverty and other measures like that, to kind of back up this K point. But I think it is kind of subjective, like what like level of granularity do you look at? And in terms of thinking about the shape of what's happening. I take your point, Alex, about kind of the main focus might be the people who are doing worse, but I also think that there's a general value in like sort of understanding the overall trajectory of the economy as well. And if the average overall trajectory is positive, that kind of gets into my point about like how kind of like fine-grained are you, but I do think that there's value in looking at the things that are improving as well as the things that are getting worse. And there might be a lot to learn in both cases, or you might want to help the people who are getting worse, but without sabotaging the people who are getting better. So I think the whole picture is relevant. I guess I don't take the view of just like focus on the weakest link. I don't know, not that that's what you were saying, but I do think it's useful to think about what's happening overall.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's important to keep in our heads, the question of what do we want out of the economy, and if we want it to provide the most benefit to the people. Actually, the subtitle of the book is, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. So I think we can all get behind the idea that we want an economy that's working for the people. But I get your point, Bethany. If it's just a couple of guys in New Jersey who are falling behind, that's not as big of a deal as millions and millions of people. But I also think it's true that whether it's millions of people or whether it's a couple guys in New Jersey, if you have something like a basic income, that helps in both cases. If for whatever reason the economy is leaving two people behind and you have a basic income, well, then those two people aren't going to be left behind anymore. And if for whatever reason you have millions of people being left behind, then millions of people aren't going to be left behind anymore. So in terms of how serious the problem is, I think you're right. But in terms of the solution, it's the same either way. I think basic income helps either way.
In the chat, just really briefly, Austin said that he wanted us to talk about calibrated basic income specifically. He thinks that's important for the idea of the idea of everyone benefiting from a rising economy. And I think that's true because for anyone tuning in who's not familiar with the show, the whole idea of the calibrated basic income is that as the economy does better, right, for everyone, for businesses are getting more productive, basic income is something you can actually raise to match that. You can make sure that everyone gets better. So that's different. I think if someone is assuming we're talking about a basic income that's just supposed to be like at a sufficiency level, because if it's stuck there, then all of this would apply, right? Well, the worst off people in the economy are still they're still at a fixed level, and they're not benefiting. They're not really reacting to the changes going on in the economy, right? So I guess that's important to clarify for if someone's listening who hasn't heard of this idea before.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up, Derek. Because of course, in my mind, when you were speaking, I was thinking about a basic income that's level was somewhat responsive to like capacity, but we hadn't said that explicitly, and it absolutely could be that we're just talking about something fixed, and then it doesn't really reflect potential.
Yeah, that's super important. Thanks for bringing that up, Austin. The basic income, of course, is just a way of getting people money. It's the same amount of money to everyone, and then the amount of it, we can talk about what the amount of it could be. But if the economy is able to be more productive, then the amount of money that people can spend into the economy, the amount of stuff they can buy is higher. So you can have a higher basic income. Let's get into the next quote here. Although monetary policy, i.e. actions taken by the nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, calmed financial markets and helped many larger companies avoid bankruptcy by lending them vast sums of money, fiscal policy, i.e. actions taken by our elected representatives in Congress and the White House, deserves the lion's share of the credit for propping up the economy in the immediate wake of the COVID-19 crisis. Indeed, the major reason the US economy began to stabilize so quickly was because fiscal policy unleashed a torrent of measures to get free money, grants, and cash payments rather than loans into the hands of workers and smaller companies. So I think we're on board with the idea that the fiscal boost had a huge effect, that was the main thing that kind of prevented the crisis from being worse than it was, especially for ordinary people. But something interesting to note here is that she's using the term workers to describe ordinary people. This kind of spin is common with MMT and mainstream economics. Some of the free money came in the form of unemployment insurance, which of course is restricted to people classified as workers. But we also had stimulus checks, which were not conditioned on employment or previous employment. These checks even went to people who aren't workers, like me and my infant daughter. So that's important to keep in mind as well. And I think as we read this book and we see the term workers come up again and again, we need to think about, well, does she just mean ordinary people, right? Is she using it as just kind of a synonym for ordinary people? Or in some contexts, is she saying workers to specifically mean people who have jobs or are looking for jobs or in the labor market, who want to sell their labor for money, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I think people who are used to this vernacular, right, and referring to the common people as workers, they would sort of say, well, this is okay, we get it, right? Not everybody works, but it's important, right, because that kind of categorization can affect how much money you spend out, who gets it. And even the unemployment benefits during this pandemic, I mean, it's questionable to what extent that's really, was this new version of it more beneficial because it was, more targeted or more effectively reached workers, or was it because it was actually less effective, right? That was actually more, it went to more people. I mean, I myself, for example, qualified. I didn't qualify as a worker before in order to receive those benefits. And suddenly in the pandemic, I did. And then when I work, I don't get the benefits. I'm supposed to report that I worked, and then I don't get them anymore, right? So in a way, it's not even that accurate to say they're going to workers, except by this kind of loose categorization that we feel that it's important that people are showing that they're going to work, or proving that they're going to work. So ultimately, this fiscal infusion, this cash benefits, I mean, it helped people by giving them cash which they could actually exchange for goods that were available. That's where the benefit occurs. And if we tell a story about work on the margins of that, that's not really what that part of that's not what that policy is really for, I don't think.
Yeah, well, first of all, Annabelle worked hard. She works hard for the money, Alex. I don't know if you want to disparage our 8-month-old's efforts. But yeah, I think that it's interesting because it really frames the narrative to use this term workers, which is something that you point out a lot, Alex, but it becomes almost unconscious. We're just so used to it, but it really does imply exactly what Derek was saying, which is that deserving people are the people who work. And the default is that they're working, and kind of only under crisis conditions would they be getting money, not for working, which Derek pointed out. It's like, oddly, you kind of get the unemployment when you're not working, but you're still considered a worker in terms of like the expectation that you'll work as soon as you can, and all of this kind of stuff. So I do think it's interesting. I mean, she's good at pointing out the very blatant rhetoric around deficits, and how like that conversation is always framed in a particular way. But she definitely has this other way of, she has this other common framing going for sure, which is to frame people in terms of workers and imply that that's who deserves money. Yeah.
I don't want to sidetrack the discussion, but just something interesting to point out here really briefly is that a lot in this book, she's going to talk about the difference between what we can do, like what's economically possible, and then what's sort of a political restraint, something that we decide is expedient, just politically for the system to work. And I don't think that we talk about it so much anymore these days, Alex. She's correct here to talk about what the Fed can and can't do, but it is it's important to note that there's not technically something stopping an institution like the Fed from paying out these cash benefits directly. We've set it up this way for an important reason, but if we're looking at the Fed as a part of the government, the point here should be that what's allowing Congress to authorize the dispensation of this helicopter money, it's not that they have the political authority to do that. I mean, that's part of it maybe, but it's also important that when they distribute this helicopter money, that money, that those US dollars are claiming goods, and that's not really mentioned here. It's going to the political, the sort of political authority granting the Fed, the ability or inability to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally true that any institution can do whatever they're allowed to do, right? But I think there's also an important distinction between fiscal policy and monetary policy, where fiscal policy has to do with taxing and spending, and then monetary policy is what the central bank does. They generally swap assets. So they issue their own liabilities, the base money of the economy, in exchange for private sector liabilities or treasury securities, that kind of thing. So they're always swapping one kind of money for another kind of money. There's no just naked spending by the central bank. Now, you could create a law that says the central bank is allowed to do this, but then you'd essentially be allowing the central bank to do fiscal policy is kind of the way I think about it. So I think it's useful to keep these conceptual distinctions, even if you acknowledge that the legal structures can be whatever you want them to be.
I was just going to mention that one thing that I noticed in the other introduction, which I'm sure we'll get to, is that at times she is very explicit about there being a limit based on the real resources in the economy. So this is kind of to your point, Derek, about claiming real resources or real products, and that inflation is kind of an index of whether you've gone too far with your spending rather than the deficit. So that kind of felt very familiar in terms of how we might talk about things here. And then at other times, I think she's really trying to emphasize the point that we should get less hung up on limitations of the deficit and that we have room to spend more. So in other points of the introduction, she kind of speaks as if there is no limit. She doesn't exactly say that, but she's just sort of has this exuberance about how like we can be spending more and we're not really limited. The government can spend what it wants. So it's not that it's inconsistent, but she kind of emphasizes the limitations of sort of real resources and inflation at various points. And then at other points, she's kind of more emphasizing that we're really at this point not constrained primarily by deficit or anything else, that we're really constrained by political will and understanding it by sort of the general voter. And so anyway, I just noticed that kind of different framing in different places in the intro. And I don't know if somebody who isn't looking at it carefully or who only saw one part of that might get confused about where the limits are or how often she emphasizes them, but they are in there, and they are very similar to what we talk about.
Yeah, and I have to say though, even though it's similar, it's not the same. And I don't like I don't like combining the resource constraint with what Stephanie Kelton calls the inflation constraint. So she has this idea that if the government is spending more money than we have the resources to handle, then that's when you get inflation or something like that. What I like to emphasize is that you can have inflation at any level of resource usage, at any level of economic output. And that, it's not necessarily going to be an indicator of anything about whether the government's spending too much or whether we're close to hitting our resource limits or not. So there is a real resource constraint on what the economy can do, and that's very important. But you can't just look at inflation to tell if we're getting close to that constraint. And there is a price level constraint as well. If your money's purchasing power is not stable over time, then it's not functioning well as money. So you've got these two constraints. One is a constraint on what the economy can do, the real resource constraint, and the other is a constraint on the functioning of money, and that's the price level constraint. So I like to keep these two things separate, and I think MMT often combines them into one thing, and that's something we might get to later if we have enough time.
But isn't it the case that even despite the fact that you might be able to have inflation without maxing out resource use, isn't it the case that if you do max out resource use and you keep pumping money in, what happens is inflation? Like I feel like that is relevant to point out.
If you increase the flow of consumer spending relative to the flow of economic output, then that's inflation. Now, you can do that at any level of economic output, and being at the maximum is one specific case where even if you wanted to, you couldn't increase the level of economic output.
Well, yeah, but it's not just one. I mean, it is one specific case, but I do feel like there's a natural question that arises if you're saying, that the government technically can keep printing money, which it can, right? But like, what happens? Okay, so like, what happens if it just keeps on printing it? Like that's a natural question, and it just keeps on printing it forever, massively, and there's just no way that the flow of resource production can keep up with the flow of spending as a result. Then you get inflation. Like I do feel like that's an important point for people to understand, that perhaps they already understand to some extent, so you can kind of anchor them there. And then you can kind of add in this more subtle point, which is that technically you can get inflation at other levels too. But
so what I like to emphasize, and there's a reason why I emphasize this, I don't emphasize that. I mean, obviously, if the government spends, unlimited money forever into the productive economy, then there's only so much the economy can produce. Then you get inflation. But the constraint is not. It's not just inflation. It's that you're running out of stuff for the economy to produce. The economy can only produce so much stuff, and that is so. I emphasize. No matter how much the government spends, there's a limit to how much the economy can produce. So I start from that direction, right? And obviously inflation is a consequence. Part of the problem with some of what I see from MMT is that they say, oh, if the government spends too much, you might get inflation, but also inflation isn't that much of a problem. Maybe a little bit of inflation is good sometimes, or we don't need to be so worried about inflation. Inflation isn't such a big deal. And that is not emphasizing the real resource constraint. Sometimes it almost sounds like MMTers are saying, if the government spends too much, you get inflation, but inflation isn't a big deal, right? What I like to emphasize is that the government can spend an infinite amount of money. There's still going to be a limit to how much the economy can produce. And I think that's a clearer way of understanding what's going on.
Well,
yeah, I mean
I mean, we were going to get to this quote about inflation
Yeah.
here, and talk about that. I mean, I'm very critical of how she frames this. I don't really want to get into it right now.
Well,
we can move on to the next thing, but I
Yeah.
guess I wanted, as I understand it, even if we imagined a kind of steelman inflation hawk MMT, who really was not making that kind of more permissive stance on it, it's still the case, right, that there's lots of scenarios where you can be at the apparent limits of inflation, but you're not at the economy's capacity. In fact, we would probably say that would be true for almost any economy that we can think of historically, right, that's experienced an inflation problem. So it is true that when the economy reaches, overspends its productive capacity, you would get inflation there. It's also true you would get inflation in lots of other scenarios where you aren't doing that. And so I think maybe that's the useful thing.
And most of the real
separating
world,
these two things, like stagflation did not mean that we were at the economy's absolute maximum capacity. It didn't mean that.
Right. Or there are some people who believe that it did, but I don't believe that it did. And inflation doesn't have to be an indicator of that. And I think when you frame it the way that Stephanie Kelton is framing it, it almost sounds like she's not quite saying this, but it almost sounds like, well, if you see inflation, then you're at the limit of government spending or something like that.
I guess for what it's worth, as I mentioned earlier, in the intro for the actual book, which maybe we're going to get to, she does emphasize the real resource constraint quite a bit, like maybe even more than the inflation constraint. So I don't know what the rest of the book will look like, but I just noted that when I was reading it.
She doesn't separate the two, and I don't talk about an inflation constraint. I talk about a price stability constraint. So in order for money to function, you can't have too much inflation or deflation, and it's not connected to the resource constraint. Is all.
I mean, not to push this too hard, but it is connected in the sense that, like, again, if you go past the resource constraint, that's what happens, right? You end up with inflation.
Sure, but most of the times we see inflation, that's not what's happening in the real world. And there's all kinds of things that can lead there to be a mismatch in the level of economic output and the level of consumer spending that cause inflation or deflation.
Would you say that it's a constraint on spending, this price stability constraint, that's different from the real resource constraint?
I would say the real resource constraint is the constraint on how much total spending there can be, and the price stability constraint is a constraint on how the demand curve can be shaped in the economy. So you've got the price elasticity of aggregate demand and all of that. That's where that kind of stuff comes in. So in order for the price level to remain stable, the demand curve has to be shaped in a certain way. And depending on, if it's a steeper demand curve, then you have lower output. If it's a shallower demand curve, then you have higher output. But it's all at the same price level, that kind of thing.
Is a way of summing this up that, like, I get why you're doing this, because we need to observe that price stability constraint. If you don't observe the price stability general constraint, then your money's not going to work anymore. But that's totally separate from the issue, right, of whether or not we're actually we're at the economy spending limits, because your spending limits are also determined by how you spend. And so when you're talking about really being at the economy's capacity, you sort of have to be assuming that you're spending in at least a reasonably efficient way. And that's often not the case. And so by separating those two things clearly, I mean, you framed it earlier more of an issue of, like, maybe she's downplaying inflation. I don't really know if you need to go there. I mean, you can go look at it from the other angle, and just stress that just because you're seeing a little bit of inflation does not mean that you're sort of the problem that you have. You might have a problem with the price stability constraint, and you might have a problem with monetary policy. You might have a problem with how you're spending, but it doesn't mean that you have a problem with real resources. It doesn't mean you have a problem with capacity.
Yeah, and when you're asking about a spending constraint, you can kind of divide that up into two different things. One is, what's the real spending constraint? How much real spending can the government undertake? And that depends on the distribution of the spending, as well as the resources that are available in the economy. And then you can ask the question, what's the nominal spending constraint. And there's essentially none. If you don't care about inflation, the government can nominally spend as much money as they want. But in real terms, no amount of inflation is going to allow the government to purchase more resources in real terms, because that's an actual real constraint. So inflation doesn't really get us around anything. And maybe that's not worth emphasizing here, but just the idea that the inflation constraint, I don't talk about inflation, I talk about the price level constraint and the real resource constraint are two different constraints, and they're constraining two different things. And yes, they can bump up against each other in specific kind of corner cases. If the economy is at full output and you try to spend more, then you would be violating the price level constraint because there are no more resources to match the spending, that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, let's get to the next quote. By fall, as fiscal support evaporated, the pace of the economic recovery began to slow, and 8 million people fell into poverty. 1 in 5 workers was unemployed, underemployed, or had suffered a pay cut since the pandemic began. So I think the thing to notice here is that she's still kind of associating the poverty with the unemployment. And in the previous quote, there was actually something I wanted to mention, was that she mentioned workers and she also mentioned small businesses. So a question we can ask is, why do we want to support businesses directly? Why do we care about businesses, small, large, or otherwise, right? And if we need them to employ people, then kind of the answer is obvious. But if the only purpose of businesses is to provide goods and services for consumers, then you'd want to support consumers, and then that consumer spending would keep the businesses active that we need to be active during this time. Maybe there are some businesses that would be really costly to rebuild again, to reactivate again once the economy is kind of back to normal, and we'd want to provide them some life support. But again, we'd want to disconnect that from the idea that, we want to keep these businesses going to keep people employed or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, she's probably thinking about employment, but I do think that there is quite a bit of cost to the creation of many of these businesses and their reputation in the community and all sorts of things like that. So it does seem like a pandemic is sort of a rare situation where you kind of hope it's going to be a temporary stepping away from these businesses, and it might make sense to float their capacity, small and large, over that period of time. So I am kind of sympathetic to that in this situation, much more so than maybe I would be in other situations. Where perhaps businesses are just not useful anymore, and it's good for them to, or not efficient, and it's good for them to go.
That makes sense. And I once tried to write an essay kind of exploring that question. The how do you hibernate the economy during a crisis? The issue, and I think maybe where Alex is coming from is he's aware that if you imagine an economy at full output, at maximum spending, when you do that comes at a cost. There's not any way that you can, if you have a maximally efficient business sector that's producing as many goods as possible for consumers, when you start preserving businesses that consumers don't want right now, something else will have to give. And so not in every case and not immediately, but at a large enough scale, eventually, yes. And so a lot of these days, a lot of the programs that we're doing to rescue small businesses under threat from the pandemic, that helps a lot of people right now in the absence of any other policy. In a calibrated basic income world, you would be diverting resources away from people and to firms, to keep firms around that people don't need right now. So definitely your point is valid. It makes sense, because if you were convinced that we're going to want these businesses later, then it makes sense to subsidize some of them, keep them going. But that does come at a cost. That would come at a cost in a full output economy in a way that we just don't see today. We just don't have a way of processing or witnessing that.
I think that's a great point. I do think it might be worth it in some cases, but there would be that kind of cost benefit. So imagine you don't want to have companies decide that they're going to just trash all of their airplanes or can't afford to keep them. And then we have to build airplanes again. And it's super resource intensive and really not a good idea. And I don't know exactly where the line would be. And of course, politicians wouldn't either, but there are some, set of trade-offs for people who have poured their life's work into this whatever restaurant. Maybe that restaurant should be kept afloat, at the expense of the basic income. I don't really know. But you'd have to weigh these things carefully. And I agree, it's not something we're up against right now, which is kind of a theme of her book, because her book is emphasizing that we're not up against our spending limits right now. So we don't actually have to make these kinds of trade-offs in the same way, technically. She still talks about trade-offs and kind of keeping resources maximized and stuff, but I think she's emphasizing more that you kind of get the free lunch at the moment if you can just get past the deficit myth as she talks about it. And then, later on, I don't know if she gets into what would happen in a sort of fully optimized spending situation. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a great point, Derek.
Yeah, she's definitely emphasizing that we do, since our resources are underutilized, we do have the equivalent of a free lunch, at least for right now. That is maybe pragmatically true. It can be rhetorically challenging to convince people from that perspective, because it sounds like she's saying, and she's not actually saying this, but it sounds like she's saying the government can just spend as much as they want. So that's why I like to start with describing what the constraints are. What are our constraints? And then saying, okay, well, if our constraints are real resources, maybe our constraints aren't tax revenue. So the question is, how many resources do we have available? And we can start asking questions from that direction, while keeping in mind what the constraint actually is. And then once you've activated everything you can activate, you can start thinking about trade-offs, that we can make within those constraints. And I think that's a more useful framework, especially since it doesn't just apply to right now when we're not using all our resources. It also applies to once we get everything going kind of efficiently, and we have efficient use of resources and that kind of thing.
I of course agree with that, but I do want to say that I think she does make it very clear in some sections. I think in the next chapter anyway, she at least writes that, like, look, MMT is not saying there's a free lunch, right? And there's a limited amount of resources the economy has. So she says that, and I think what you're trying to say, what you're pointing out, is that the way that she phrases the other side of it when she talks about the spending that we can do now, the words she's choosing to use and the metaphors she's choosing to use can make it sound like she's creating a contradiction between these two statements. And I agree with you that your approach, where you start by emphasizing here's what it looks like when we're at the real limits, that works really well, because then you totally invalidate the arguments of people who are, well, you address the arguments of the people who are concerned about scarcity. You just pull the rug out from under that, and now because you've fully incorporated it into the model, and then you can talk about how to get to that level.
Yeah, she wouldn't need to emphasize that MMT isn't saying that, we get a free lunch. She wouldn't need to say all of that if it was obvious that MMT wasn't saying that, or if it was obvious what constraints MMT was emphasizing.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree, but I guess rhetorically I was somewhat persuaded or appreciative of her approach in the introduction to the main book, because she's really attacking head on what she thinks of as like the primary and most pernicious misconception. And she's saying, like, here's the misconception. It's wrong. It's wrong. It's wrong. So you kind of know where she's going in the book. And I think that is another way. I don't see that as necessarily worse than how, you might do it, Alex.
Right.
It's especially because she's weaving in the political world a lot more than we also tend to do on this.
So that's why I said at the beginning that we are not her audience. Her audience is people who've never really questioned the idea that, government spending isn't constrained by tax revenue, or people who, are supporters of MMT and really want a kind of accessible text to refer back to, that kind of thing. We're not her audience. So we have to keep that in mind as we read the book.
And I think our concern, right, would be, because I don't think that we're necessarily have a problem with framing an argument in a certain way to try to reach this argument. But the problem is then when that creeps into the theory, right? And I think to some extent that may have occurred here a little bit, because there are statements that where that boundary is crossed, and because we've made that very clear, I think, in conversations we've had with some MMTers, and we find that that there's obstacles to talking about the world where spending is maximized and what the trade-offs are there. When you're approaching your theory of the economy through this lens of, like, okay, here's this myth we have that economics has, or that the general population has, about the deficit problem and how it's really false, and you design a theory to kind of unpack that misunderstanding. That can actually, if you don't do that properly, you can if you're not being really careful in the way you phrase things, then you're going to start saying things that just aren't true anymore in a world where you have maximized the spending.
Yeah, that's right. So we're getting towards the end and we still have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm actually going to skip ahead and get to this next quote here. Eager to see a relief bill make it across the finish line, the Minneapolis Fed president urged Congress and the White House to come together aggressively to put money in the hands of people who have lost their jobs and to support small businesses so that we don't have this continuing wave of bankruptcies across the economy. So I think this is important. I think, during a time of crisis, at the very least, you want to help keep things as close to normal as you can, or prevent things from deviating as too far from even if the existing system is broken but it can kind of like move along how it's going. When the crisis hits, the first thing you need to do is at least protect what you already have. So, in that sense, the idea that we want to insure people against losing jobs, it makes a little bit more sense if you think about it in that context, because that's kind of the status quo. That's how we're running the economy, is we're expecting people to have jobs. So you might want to protect against that.
Do you want to just go through a few quotes rapidly, Alex? Because I know you have a lot. Probably
there's a lot to cover. Let's hear them and then pick out the interesting points.
Okay. The problem is it takes me a couple seconds to get the next quote up. So I'm always hoping for like 5 seconds of talking and then I can share the next quote. Yeah.
That doesn't usually work.
So Mr. Powell understands that the Fed can't do what the Fed can't do. Reminding lawmakers of what the Fed can't do, Powell said, the Fed has lending powers, not spending powers. Unlike Congress, he explained, the Fed cannot grant money to particular beneficiaries. That's an important difference between monetary and fiscal policy. Only Congress can authorize the dispensation of a kind of helicopter money that airlifts financial aid directly into the bank accounts of its targeted recipients. So this is kind of what we were getting at before. Even if you could remove the legal distinction between the Fed and the fiscal authority, there's still this conceptual distinction between fiscal policy and monetary policy. And that's useful to keep in mind. Obviously they could tell Jay Powell, hey, now you're allowed to throw helicopter money and expand only the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet. But that's not normal. That's not how things are set up now. And even if we changed the legal stuff, the conceptual difference would still be there.
There's a real difference between monetary and fiscal policy. But I think maybe one of the elephants in the room here is that in order to, we can ask why is monetary policy so inefficient compared or so unable to do these things that fiscal policy is able to do? And I think employment is part of that story, right? Like if you're expecting people to reap the benefits of monetary policy by getting jobs that are supported on credit, right? Like, and you compare that to just giving people money, right? It's obvious that there's fewer barriers in the latter mechanism. So I think the one of the reasons why monetary stimulus does not filter down efficiently to consumers is because we have the labor market is there, which is currently sort of, if you're expecting it to filter down through that, it's not going to do that. It's not going to get to everyone. And when it does get to more people, there's no guarantee that money that it's as much spending as it could possibly be, right? It's like kind of running it through the lottery and seeing what comes out. Whereas with fiscal policy, you don't have to do that. You can just say, well, we've decided it's best for people to have more money, and then you get it done.
Yeah, with monetary policy, you're basically tweaking the incentives for private credit creation, and you can't really control where that goes, whereas fiscal policy can be targeted however you want it to be. And I think Powell is exactly right about that. So let's get to the next quote, which is from the real introduction of the book. The truth is, the federal government is nothing like a household or a private business. That's because Uncle Sam has something the rest of us don't: the power to issue the US dollar. Uncle Sam doesn't need to come up with dollars before he can spend. The rest of us do. Uncle Sam can't face mounting bills he can't afford to pay. The rest of us might. Uncle Sam will never go broke. The rest of us could. So, I have a lot of issues with this. Certainly, whoever you are, you're the only one who can issue liabilities signed by you. If you are the central bank of the United States, if you're the Fed, you're the only one who can issue liabilities of the Fed. And it just so happens that the liabilities of the Fed are the base money for the economy. But that doesn't mean that other people can't issue dollar-denominated liabilities. And that's what the credit system is. There's an entire credit superstructure built on top of that base money. And if the Fed does not behave, if the Fed isn't maintaining a stable pricing and payments standard with its US dollar currency unit, then the economy is going to punish them, right? They're going to, or not, they're not going to, they don't care about punishing the Fed, but they're going to find a standard that actually does work, and they're going to denominate their debts in some other unit. So there is, the Fed sits at the top of the hierarchy. The federal government sits at the top of the money hierarchy, and that's important. But it's also important that what they have to do to stay at the top of the hierarchy is important. And each dollar that they issue is a promise. It's a promise that it can be exchanged. It's a note that says you can claim a certain amount of stuff from the economy. And that's the price level constraint, right? The Fed is bound by the price level constraint, and the federal government is bound by the price level constraint. And if they don't keep that promise, then people aren't going to trust that promise anymore. So I think there's, the next chapter when we get into is, don't think of a household. And it's all about how the federal government isn't like a household. But I think it's a matter of degree. I think the federal government is able to issue liabilities that are more widely trusted. And that's why their liabilities are being used as base money for the rest of the economy. So I think MMT likes to highlight a more stark qualitative difference between governments and households or other institutions and that kind of thing. And I think it's more of a quantitative difference, more of a continuum.
And
go ahead.
From an intellectual perspective, I think this is a really elegant take, and I think it has practical implications. But if you were just trying to start to take on this household misconception that people tend to have, in the sense that really it's like the government has to balance budgets just the way that I do and so on. And it's all like putting it off to the future if they don't. There just seems to be a lot of real misconceptions that she's trying to attack very clearly. And I'm wondering how you would put it yourself if you wanted like a pithy response the way she's doing one here, since you don't seem to be happy with the way that she does it.
Yeah, that's a really important question, and she is a very very good, very clear, very pithy writer, and she's a great speaker too. I don't know if you've seen her speak, but I think my starting point would be about emphasizing the credit of the government. How much do you trust their liabilities? And if you're just one person, nobody knows who you are. Everybody knows who the government is, and everybody can see the government keeping their promises. Even if your word is as good as gold, nobody knows you, right? And everybody knows the government, and they have institutions that make sure that their word is as good as gold, right? So that's kind of the approach that I would start with. I don't know what particular wording I would use, but it's about trust. It's about how much you trust the promises that are issued by a government versus everybody else. And then you can have the hierarchy, right? Then you can have the banks where you deposit money in the bank, and for all practical purposes, your bank deposits are a form of money in the economy, right? Because all the banks, are willing to, take deposits from each other and that kind of thing. So you're able to really have a clearer sense of the hierarchical nature of money, and that there's different ways to make payments, and that there is something at the top of the hierarchy, but that's not a qualitatively different thing.
To attempt a pithy one, something I do sometimes like to say is that most people's in a monetary economy, most people's debts are promises to pay money. The government's debts are promises for goods. So that's an important difference between the two. But it doesn't create obstacles to understanding the important ways in which they are similar. So when you say the government is not like a household or not like a private business, which she also says later in the book, well, really, because it's not the case that expanding debt is necessarily a problem for a household or a business too. I guess the difference is that the household and the business are trying to make profit, whereas the government is trying to manage the goods, right? So if you think of both these things, the debt and the money being promises, That's pretty simple, and it also doesn't run afoul of the people she's trying to argue against, right? Because I've talked to a lot of people who Stephanie Kelton would call deficit hawks, and they're not confused about the government's technical ability to print money. They know that that's possible, and they're worried about it because they're worried about the government's promises not being met by goods, right? And so if you're gonna argue convincingly against those people's concerns, you're gonna have to demonstrate how it is the case that the government will be able to keep its promises, to manage its debt, if you will.
Yeah, I like that. Money is a promise to pay goods. Goods sit at the top of the hierarchy of money, right? And then the base money sits below goods. Anything at any level in the hierarchy is a promise to pay something at a higher level of the hierarchy. So all different levels of money are promises to pay goods, right? And then anything that sits below the base money hierarchy is a promise to pay either goods or base money, right? So it kind of goes that way all the way down the hierarchy. Anything at a bottom level of the hierarchy is a promise to pay any of the things that sit above it in the hierarchy. And this also relates to the idea that Uncle Sam will never go broke. Well, Uncle Sam is issuing promises to pay goods. Uncle Sam goes broke when you run out of goods, and that's inflation, right? Or when you when the money isn't able to purchase to claim the same amount of stuff, that's inflation. That's Uncle Sam going broke, right? So it really is an analogous thing. It's not a qualitatively different kind of institution. It's just where they are on the hierarchy.
So she's not wrong that the government, she's not wrong to say the government doesn't have to collect the money before it spends. But this is just an example. When you say something like Uncle Sam can't go broke, that's just an example of the kind of thing you can say, which is going to make your other statements about the real sources sound like you're contradicting yourself.
Yeah, that's right. So let me go to one more quote before we end. Here we go. So this is a short one. If we wanted to, we could pay off the debt immediately with a simple keystroke. So the idea here is that the debt, the national debt, is just a record, and you could delete the number and then it's gone. And I hear MMT say this kind of thing a lot. I find it a little bit frustrating because you're not eliminating the debt. What you're doing is you're eliminating the record of the debt. The debt is the money that exists in the economy, right? There's still dollars that are out there that have to claim goods, right? And we have to keep that promise. The government has to keep that promise. So to say that we could pay off the debt is. Now, I think, obviously, I actually do think Stephanie Kelton understands this, but this rhetoric, I think, is problematic, this particular framing, because you don't want to pay off the debt. You don't want to eliminate these government liabilities because that's our money.
Yeah, and there are also portions of that debt which, there are portions of the debt which are more important than others. There are portions of it which are serving other important functions besides just being the money that people spend, right? So when you talk about wiping off the debt as if that would be a beneficial thing, that's kind of almost, I don't know, that's almost kind of the opposite argument that she's making in a lot of the book.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I actually am going to go to one more final quote here. Can't resist. The fact that the typical American worker has seen virtually no real wage growth since the 1970s is a crisis. I think that's not a crisis, right? The fact that the typical American citizen or resident has seen virtually no real income growth since the 1970s is maybe a crisis. And that's how we would frame it if we're thinking more from a basic income perspective.
Yeah, although not to be pedantic, but steadiness doesn't feel like a crisis at all. Like, what if the wealth level was really great in the 70s? You know, we've just kind of been cruising on that. But anyway, that's sort of more of a side point.
Yeah, yeah. And then the term maybe instead of crisis, just say like a bad thing, right? A crisis implies that there's some breakdown in the system or something like that. And
I think also implied here is that we could be doing better. Like, we know that wealth is growing in other ways, and we know that like the inequality is growing in a lot. You know, there's sort of other context to this. So maybe I took us on a tangent there. But
yeah.
All
right. Any final thoughts about the introduction, Derek?
I would like to. Oh, sorry,
Bethany, go ahead.
You said Derek, and I jumped in. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Bethany.
I had a sort of big picture thought. At the very last sentence of the book introduction talks about how basically like no one can save us but the government or something like that. Fiscal spending is really what we need. And of course, like I'm pretty sympathetic to that view, and we are here too as well in terms of just thinking about, for example, a government-sponsored basic income, government healthcare. But I couldn't help but imagine, because she brings politics into it so much, that the people who really don't trust the government to do a good job. So it's not a question of what the government for them could do in an ideal world. It's a question of what the government is going to do in the real world. And is the government actually going to handle things well? And for them, it might be quite dystopian to think that the government is the only thing that can help have a robust economy, because they think the government's always going to be kind of corrupt and like kind of inefficient and bloated and just not going to do a good job. So even if theoretically it could do a good job, it won't. And so that's kind of hopeless then for a person who doesn't trust the government. Whereas you might think, oh, well, if you can kind of have a bunch of actors acting selfishly in the market, but that ends up working out, like that's a lot more plausible to actually happen, because it's just people acting selfishly and then it works out well, et cetera. So I just think that's an interesting perspective not to forget when we read something like this, which is really putting a lot of weight on what the government needs to do. When the government doesn't always operate well. I mean, consider in the extreme case, like a dictator who just wants to enrich himself and his family or something like that. And we are seeing a lot of signs of issues with trust, not just from, say, like conservatives, but also from people who maybe are libertarian or really into cryptocurrencies, or don't think the government should manage the currency at all, et cetera. So like there are these issues, and it is a real question whether the government is ever going to do the things that actually are the best things to do. So I just wanted to bring that perspective in, because it stands out because she's so clear in her rhetoric about the government being our savior. So I just thought worth keeping in mind while we read the book.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who feel that way, and that's I don't know if I'm one of those people who feels that way, but definitely this is why I find it helpful to talk about policy and money in the economy, and then if the government is a convenient and reliable agent that can administer that, great. And then in parts of the world where maybe that's not the case, we can talk about other means to get it done. But that way, when you get into these conversations with people who are going to pin everything on the fact that like they believe the government is the most inefficient and horrible, wasteful system imaginable, that's okay. You can still talk about, well, here's somehow money in the economy has to be managed anyway. So if it's not the government, someone has to be doing. What does that management look like? You can't really avoid those conversations, even if you are taking sort of a hardline skeptical stance on government policy.
Yeah. And then what is the government? If someone's managing your economy and managing your money, and they're not the government, then maybe they are the government, because they're doing what the governments do, right? So maybe if your government isn't acting responsibly in the interest of your economy and the interest of your people, what you have to do is you have to replace the government, right? There's always got to be institutions. It's always a hybrid, right? There's people acting in their self-interest. There's institutions managing the system. You can't really escape that. And I think there are some people who wish you could. Anyway, that's an interesting final thought. So that's the discussion for today. Next week, we're going to talk about chapter 1 of Deficit Myth, Don't Think of a Household. So we're going to really get into more of the household analogy, to what extent you can think of the government as being like a household or not. We talked a little bit about that today. We'll get more into it next week. Thanks, guys.